thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity to talk to you about nitriding. And don't expect me to deliver a very orthodox lecture, because that's not my purpose. So first of all, what I want to talk about is the connection between materials, between the application field, and also some nitriding. So practically, it's surface engineering is gaining its importance very much in the last couple of years, let's say so, last 20 years. And this will reshape our thinking in heat treatment, surface treatment, and the application. What I do, and what I will try to present you, is a kind of application-oriented idea on nitriding. Nitriding, I say nitriding, but this is a very large area. So practically, when we talk about nitriding, there are many, many versions, many possibilities of nitriding, to use nitrogen, nitrogen alone, and nitrogen in combination with other elements to improve the surface properties. So, what is first of all important is that what I will present you, certainly there are a few ideas on the theory of nitriding, on the reaction kinetics, but we don't go too deep into this aspect because you can read it. This is a separate matter. What I want to emphasize much more is the interdependence of the possibilities offered by nitriding and the materials. To talk about the philosophy of selecting materials for nitriding or for surface engineering purposes, which is extremely important, is more important than much time it was thought about. So, well, let's start in a few words from the development of materials and the material science. It's very interesting. Today, we live in an era when the development of material science is more than dynamic. It's unbelievable sometimes. So what we see all over the world, that new materials appear, new application areas, and materials appear, and we learn daily something new about materials. So when we are talking about different surface engineering procedures, we have never to forget that it's extremely important to think of materials, to think of the fact that heat treatment and surface engineering is part of material science. So whatever we do, we have to consider the material science aspect, we have to consider the development of materials, the development in material science, and this has been almost completely changed in the last couple of years. I want to emphasize this aspect because it explains a lot. This is not new for you, so you know very well. The 20th century was a century of physics. Never in the history of mankind was such a strong development in physics as it was in the last century, beginning with Einstein's theory of relativity and further with the atomic theory, with the quantum mechanics, and so on and so on. And even now, we do not completely understand all the importance of those developments which happened in the physics in the last century, but we have to be aware of it. So we have to be aware that this development will reshape our thinking of materials, and certainly if it reshapes our thinking of materials, it will reshape also our thinking of surface engineering. Well, and in the last 20, 25 years, an extra, let's say so in this respect, is the development of informatics, the data processing and data transmission, and this is reshaping even more our thinking as it was earlier. But you must understand one thing when we are talking about data processing and data transmission. This doesn't belong to my presentation, but as a professor, so I always tell my students, don't rely only on internet, don't rely only on those data which you can obtain easily, because you have to choose between these data. You have to model this. You have to know exactly what are you looking for. And when you give some words and will appear immediately 1 million and I don't know how many articles, how can you select if you don't understand what are you looking for? So this has to be accepted. This informatics is an extremely important tool. It helps us, but it's just a tool. But the computer will never think for you. It will give you the possibility to think and to learn more and more. Well, so this is the basis why the material science has developed a lot in the last 20-25 years. And it's extremely difficult to see what are the limits, which are really the orientations. Because day by day we will find something new and we will have to integrate this in our thinking. So it's very difficult sometimes to see in this development which are the rational limits. But I try to use this schematic presentation just to give an idea how I see the world of materials. And there are two categories basically of materials. One category is the so-called conventional materials. I use this expression, this is not an orthodox expression, but I use this expression because we got used to them. So, and the new are the emerging materials. You see, when we talk about the conventional materials, there are metals and alloys, composites, polymers, ceramics. What is important for us is that metals and alloys, and especially iron elements, heat treatment and surface engineering is a very versatile. And we have all the possibilities to modify the bulk or surface properties of iron alloys. This is not true for any of the others. Non-ferrous metals and alloys, certainly there are some possibilities for heat treatment and surface engineering, but far not so many possibilities as there are for iron alloys. And when we go to polymers, ceramics, heat treatment is not anymore possible because we obtain the bulk properties by the technological process when we elaborate these metals. Certainly there are some surface engineering possibilities also here because we can obtain deposited layers, we have some possibilities to modify the surface properties, not the bulk properties. You see, this is a very, very important aspect that when metals and alloys, and especially iron alloys, can be modified, the properties can be modified in very wide limits. This is not true for any of the others. Well, now lots of materials appear, and many of them you only heard about, like biomaterials, for instance. Biomaterials are extremely important, but for the future. Now, it's just at the beginning. Well, when we consider our modern nature is fantastic, so it's able to produce rationally the most exciting materials. And I don't want to get deeper in this, because that's another subject, and especially when we are talking about biomaterials with surface engineering, this is amazing. Once an old monk in the Far East, actually in Thailand, asked me, do you know why is the scent flower of the Buddhism the lotus? But I had no idea. I knew that this is the holy flower, but I didn't know why. Because its leaves cannot be spoiled. Its leaves remain always clean, whatever happens. Water will not adhere to the surface. Any dirt or any other liquid will not adhere to the surface. This is surface engineering made by the nature. So this is what we try to learn with biomaterials. Certainly it's a completely different subject we don't talk about. But I want to give you this overall picture, because then, when I am talking about nitriding, you can put into a frame which gives you a very large limits of understanding. Then there are the IT materials we don't talk about. I'm not a specialist in IT materials, so this is a completely different matter. But there are the nanomaterials, and this gives much more and more importance in our conventional engineering. Why? Not because the nanomaterials we use in our daily application, but the nanocoatings can give us possibilities which are extremely attractive. So I consider, and maybe I'm not too wrong when I say that the nanomaterials can form a bridge between the conventional materials and the emerging materials. Why did I tell you all this? Just because whatever we do, we have never to forget, to quote Werner Heisenberg, the part and the whole have to be always in a very close relationship. It's a vain to study the part when we have no view on the whole. So, and when we are talking about surface engineering, we are talking about a certain process. We always have to think, how can this be put into a larger understanding, into an understanding which gives us the possibility to develop new materials, new technologies. One thing is for certain. I just gave you these very brief ideas from the field of material science. But for today, the conventional materials are basically those which determine the development of industry. And certainly we have to see everything in this light. So we develop new things, we develop new materials, we develop completely new technologies. And we try to make a bridge between the emerging and the conventional materials. But we have to be aware that in today's techniques, in our today, let's say so, living, the classical, so the conventional materials are those which are still used. When we just take a few figures from statistics, I'm not too good at statistics, but still a few figures remain. So about 85% of our industrial development is connected to the steel. So steel is still remaining one of the most important materials for us. So this explains, with all this development, we have to be aware of this development. We have to be aware of the influence of this development on our daily life or the general development. But we have to know we still are working with those materials which were for centuries certainly perfected. The development of the steel industry is extremely dynamic. And we have to think about the procedures which will help us to use better mode, in a better mode, these steels or these materials, these conventional materials. Well, it's interesting, is one last thing in this respect I want to emphasize. This is the problem of time gap. What I do understand when I'm talking about the time gap is we learn a lot. New and new ideas, new and new technologies, new and new materials are discovered. But until we can use this industrially, until we can use in our daily life, there's a long period. And this is something very interesting. Years ago, so at the end of the last century practically, time between a laboratory development of new materials and new possibilities to the industrial application, this time gap was about 5 years, so something like this. It's unbelievable if I say that today the new material from the laboratory to the industrial application will take about 15 years. So everybody should think, well, with this fast development, what is around us and what is in us? Certainly this time gap should be smaller and smaller, but that's not true. It's unfortunately the time gap is increasing. There are explanations why, and it is rational. I don't want to get too much in this field, but you have to be aware of it. So, let's go back to detail of the slide which I have shown you with the materials. And let's stay with our conventional materials. And we remain practical with the metals. Because your metals, any surface engineering, surface modification are possible. And I just have shown here the possibilities for surface modification, but we come back to this. For ceramic, I told it's practically, or for composites, polymers, you cannot modify the bark properties, but you can put surface layers, but the substrate properties, they remain just as they were produced, they were fabricated. So when we go one step further and we talk about the surface, the relation between the surface and the substrate, and this is extremely important because we know very well the substrate or the bark material will give us the resistance, will give us strength, will give us toughness. So the mechanical properties are covered by the bark material. But the contact with the environment is always by the surface. So the surface is the interface between the environment and the bark material. So we have to consider that there is a system which is consisting of the bark material substrate and the surface, and these together form a system. So we can never forget that there is not one or other thing which is more important. The properties of the bark material are just as important as the properties of the surface. So we have to keep a balance between all these. And when you see, we have practically four possibilities. There is one when the surface properties will have a gradient, a gradual pass over to the subsurface. This is the case, for instance, with the surface hardening. So like induction hardening or such kind of things. Then there is another possibility when we have this, but also we have on the surface a layer with very special properties. And this will be, which is interesting for us when we talk about nitriding. And there is a third case when we have a deposit on the bark material, on the substrate, and this deposit has special properties. This is like hard chromium plating, for instance. I say hard chromium plating because I was dealing for many years with hard chromium plating. But even painting is one of these. And then there are the four when you combine these. So there are duplex or multiplex surface treatments. So what we have to know for sure, and what we have to be aware, that the properties of the surface and the bark material may change in different modes, may change drastically or may change the gradual system. So when we make one step further, this I consider very important. Usually they don't talk too much about this phenomenon or this aspect in heat treatment and surface engineering, but this is extremely important because when we talk about surface engineering, we have to know how is the surface of a material, which is a part of engineering component, and we have to understand what happens on the surface. So you see, when we consider from the bark material, there's a very sophisticated surface layer, and this sophistication will give us a lot of problems or will help us to obtain surface treated properties. Because, let's start from here up. There is always, due to the machining, due to the deformation processes, there are deformed crystals in this layer. And this is up to about 100 microns. So usually there is a layer which has practically not the original crystal structure, but deformed crystals, destroyed crystals, and so on, so rest of crystals. Then it comes a very interesting layer, the so-called Bailey layer, of 1 to 100 nanometer dimension, which is practically an amorphous layer. The crystals are destroyed in such a manner we cannot anymore talk about the crystal structure. It has a very special properties, a kind of an amorph layer. Up there is an oxide layer, so all the materials will oxidize. And whatever we do, a small oxide layer will form on the surface. And then, at the outer surface, there are absorbed gases, or from the lubricant. So there is a special, very thin layer, but it has nothing to do with the structure of the bulk material. So, when we consider all this, just think about the surface engineering, what I have shown you. The 1, 2, 3. The 4 is a different matter because it's a little bit special. So, when we try to shape what are these possibilities and how they influence the surface, the one which has a gradual will pass practically through all these surface layers and will get into the bulk material. This is extremely important because when we consider such a treatment, we have to be sure that when it reaches practically the bulk material, it still has the expected influence. When we talk about the number 2, this will never influence the deformed crystals, it will influence only the surface. And the category 3, when there are only deposits without any connection between the bulk material, then is this. So those pictures which I have shown you with the surface treatments are illustrated also here. And you always have to understand that there are these conditions which are extremely important when we want to modify the surface. Well, that's what I said, I also illustrated here. Certain of these materials you can get home. Well, now let's get to the basic of the subject, because till now I was talking a lot with no word on nitriding. But I wanted to give you an idea why this whole thing is integrated into the surface engineering process. Well, nitriding is nitriding, nitrocarburizing. So allow me to use the general term of nitriding, but we rarely apply pure nitriding. We apply different versions of nitriding. But that's important. So generally we speak about nitriding. There are a couple of very interesting points and very important points. Why I said this is a very attractive surface engineering. Not because I was dealing my whole life with nitriding. And according to my late friend Tom Bell, he also said, you are a nitrogen man, because I was dealing so much with nitriding. And just to make you to understand this, my attraction toward nitriding, that the first patent in gaseous nitrocarburizing belonged to my team, and they are applying still today. Certainly, a lot of other patents appear, but the basics remain the same. So, this is my favorite child, let's say so. So, when I'm talking about nitriding, I always think of something which practically was penetrating my whole life. Well, so, first of all, it's very important that this is a low temperature process, which is a ferritic range. It's extremely important because you know very well, you learn that deformation, any kind of deformation, is connected to the temperature range. And we have the temperature, dilatation and such kind of things, but we also have the structural changes which will cause certain deformation. So the thermal and structural modification will cause deformation. Here in ferritic range, we have no structural modification. The structure, the bulk structure, remains ferrite, and the transformation into austenite is not necessary. Well, then there is a very wide diversity of procedures in different media, gases, plasma, salt baths, so there is a wide range of procedures. Most of the procedures may be applied also for plain carbon and low LVC, and this is extremely important. Why? Because still we try, because of cost considerations, to use low alloy or plain carbon steel whenever it's possible. You must learn one thing as engineers. So an engineer has to solve not only the technical problem, but has to keep an eye always on what it costs. Because we are working in an industrial environment. Our goal is to give products with good quality, but acceptable, affordable prices. So this is, even if it doesn't belong to the surface engineering, but we must be aware of this. So, and when we are talking about this, so to apply for plain carbon steels or low alloy steels is extremely important. Then one step further, the parts which are treated may be machined for ready-made dimensions, and it's a final machining which practically no other surface treatments with diffusion cannot say something like this. So ready-made parts may be treated with no deformation, no modification. Then the tribological properties tribological fatigue properties are extremely important and are very attractive. And as it is in a ferritic range, so in a low temperature range, certainly the energy need is considerably less than for most of other treatments. And if we consider that today the drivers in industrial development, or we used to say the most important drivers, that's not maybe the most important, but important drivers, they are energy and environment. Because our sources of energy are very limited, especially as we can use it now. And the environment, so whatever we want to extract more energy and more materials, we destroy the environment. And this is a very, very sensitive question. So you hear a lot about the climate modification and so on and so on. And as the politicians are talking about, we try to keep away from that, but there are real problems. I just tell you one single, let's say so, quotation. They say that until the 80s, we used just the interest of our assets. When you consider that our asset is the Earth and the Earth's surface, which we can use for the human development, and what we extracted from the Earth and what we created, that was what we extracted. This is considered that was just the interest of our assets, the assets being what God or the nature gave us. But since the 1980s, we began to enter into the assets, which means that there are no possibilities to extend this forever. So whatever, every day, what we take from the nature remains more or less unrecuperable. So this is why energy and environment are so interesting. I just tell you one example. It doesn't belong to Nitriding, but it's interesting, and I was surprised to see we succeed to put only 15% of the Sahara with photovoltaic elements, just as we know it today. So not the most important and the most dramatic developments. We could cover the whole energy need of the globe. Then why we don't do? There are two reasons. We cannot store the energy and we cannot transport the energy. That's it. So it's not a problem to have energy, but we have to learn how to store it and how to transport it. Well, so there are extremely important all these, because when we talk about surface treatment, we talk about materials, we never have to forget that whatever we do, It's part of a system. And we always have to keep an eye how this part will influence the whole. I don't know if you know this. I just cited Werner Heisenberg with the part and the whole. This was practically one of those books which appeared in the early 20s, as far as I know, the early 20s, and practically revolutionized our understanding of the physics. And there is a also, so you can just scan it, not to read it, because that's not for, let's say so, the common people, even if we have graduated and so on, because it's absolute theory, but there are a few things which are absolutely important. Well, now come back to our basic problem. This is very important when we talk about the nitriding. The layers show a double character. This is the only surface engineering procedure where we have this kind of double character. We have on the surface a compound layer. We will talk about these layers a little bit more, but basically we have to know that a nitrided surface is always composed of these two parts, the compound layer and the diffusion layer to the substrate material. Well, certainly they are modified. There are different properties of compound layers and the diffusion layer. But this kind of a dual structure of the surface is extremely important when we consider the application field nitriding. And now I said that nitriding is a wide range of procedures. But basically, we can split in two categories. There are nitriding, which means that we only use actively the influence of nitrogen. This is a little bit an exaggeration, because whatever we do not use only, strictly the nitrogen. First of all, carbon is in the steel. And when we have a diffusion, there is a retro-diffusion as well. So what can we do whatever we want? Still there is an influence of carbon. Oxygen. This is a very special matter. And I must tell you a nice story. Just to see how things are happening. I was very young when I was working in a precision mechanical factory and textile machine factory, and I got the task to build the nitriding furnace. Frankly speaking, at that time I had no idea of nitriding, but I had to learn, and I built a furnace. This was a bell-type furnace, and we began to make experiments which later practically determined my orientation. So we made some experiments. And then I observed, until that time, the theory said that whenever you try to nitride something, you have to be sure there is no oxygen present in the medium. Well, my furnace had a little bit of problems, insulating measures and so on. We had not such possibilities as there are now. So I couldn't solve the problem to avoid oxygen. So we always had some oxygen. And I had a very interesting observation. Something is wrong with the theory, because theoretically I hadn't obtained a good layer, and I obtained a better layer than was expected, and I couldn't explain it. And I have written a short communication, a short paper, which was just by chance got into the hands of a very famous professor of crystallography in England, K. Jack. Later I met him. And reading this article, he has written me a letter, just a few lines. Well, young man, you found something very interesting which could revolutionize our thinking of nitriding. So let's do it. I congratulate you and I wish you success. Well, that was the moment when practically my future was decided with the nitrogen. It's interesting to see how the life is. So I began with my colleagues to deal with the problem of oxygen nitriding, and we got to very important conclusion, which you will see later. So, when we talk about nitriding, the basic element for diffusion is the nitrogen, but the oxygen plays always an important role, and there are some other problems as well which occur. The second category, which basically today they are more important, they are just the plain nitriding, is the so-called nitrocarburizing or ferritic nitrocarburizing. We say that and that, but practically it's ferritic nitrocarburizing because it is in ferritic range. Well, that means that we introduce into the surface nitrogen, carbon, and with some oxygen. This is when a double layer is formed. The character of the layer is the compound layer and the diffusion layer. We can discuss a lot about the importance of compound layer. We want or we don't want it. Give me a sign, please. You know, when I'm talking about nitriding, the time is something which remains behind, but I don't want to spoil the program, so you have to tell me when it's just regular. Usually that happens, but in most of my lectures, my wife is listening to the lecture. She has no idea what I'm talking about, because she is professor of English language, so she has no idea. But she is my best critic, because she always is very attentive, she always sees if the time is running out, and such kind of things you know very well. So I think she learned in the meantime some surface engineering, because hearing over 40 years about the surface engineering, that's it. Well, so this category of nitriding, nitrocarburizing, is probably today much more important than the pure nitriding. Why? Because in this complex influence of nitrogen and carbon and with some oxygen, no matter if we have alloying elements in steel or we haven't, we can obtain a very resistant, very, very good surface layer. So, now, there is one condition. Whatever you want to do, we have to select the material. Surface engineering cannot work alone. It's always a reflection of what the material is. So, when we talk about these technologies, we have to think about the selection of materials. Certainly, we are talking about steels. Well, in some respect, aluminum we try to use, but it's tricky. Titanium can also be used, but it's also tricky. So let's stay with the steels. And I said, you have seen that there is a diffusion layer. What is the transition between the surface and the bulk material? And the diffusion layer is consisting of a supersaturated ferrite, supersaturated with nitrogen ferrite, and also nitrides of the alloying elements. So, this is very important that we have to have, this is the basic condition, we have to have nitride forming elements, like chromium, like aluminum, like zirconium, molybdenum, and so on. So, when we talk about the diffusion layer, the properties of the diffusion layer are practically given by those elements which can form nitrides. So, the alloying elements. If we nitride just plain carbon steel or some low alloy steel without these nitride forming elements, we won't have any kind of surface improvement. So this is extremely important. Then the next one, which is, I said there's a dual character of the layer, is the compound layer. This is the compound layer, is a very fine monophase, but practically most of the cases there are dual phase or more complex nitride and carbonitrides, which are in a very specific form. These nitrides and carbonitrides are have a ceramic character. This is why we used to say, so whenever surface modification, where we have such kind of a compound layer, we used to say is a ceramic conversion. This was also introduced by Tom Bell, this expression, that is absolutely true. Because the compound layer, due to the combination of iron nitrides and iron carbonides, has a completely ceramic character. So, and this is extremely important. Well, in this case, the yellowing elements don't play a role. So, the yellowing elements are only important because it has to be a support layer. So, the surface of the compound layer has to be supported by a relatively strong diffusion layer. So, that's the only role of the yellowing elements. In the compound layer, the yellowing elements don't play any role. Well, this is an exception, which I quoted here, because this was for a very long time very disputed. So what happens to austenitic stainless steels? You know very well that austenitic stainless steels are important for lots of applications, including chemical industry and a lot of others. I don't want to go over this. But can we nitride austenitic stainless steel? Well, we can, certainly, but not as we do for the low alloy steels or for the normal alloy tool steels. Why? Because when we nitride at the common temperatures, so 500 and something, up to 650, austenitic stainless steel, the nitrogen will enter into combination with the chromium and is depleting the surface in chromium. When we deplete the surface in chromium, certainly the corrosion properties are changed. So the problem is with austenitic stainless steel, what we want to nitride these surfaces, then we have to know exactly, well, we can increase the wear resistance, definitely. We can increase the fatigue resistance as well, but we will drop the corrosion resistance. Can we avoid this? Yes, we do. But this is a very special surface treatment procedure, nitriding procedure, because we will have to obtain a supersaturated austenite in nitrogen without any precipitation. It's tricky. It's not so easy to obtain it. We can obtain it at very low temperatures, practically about 380 to about 420, 440 degrees centigrade. We can obtain such kind of layer. Certainly, if the temperature is so low, the diffusion is slow, which means that we can obtain very, very thin surface layers. So it's possible to obtain an austenitic stainless steel an extremely wear resistant and still corrosion resistant layer of a couple of 10 microns, up to about 45, 50 microns. And this we used to say either supersaturated nitrogen supersaturated austenite or S phase. The S phase is practically coming from Birmingham, but the phenomenon itself, first of all, was developed by the Japanese. Well, so I talked about the selection of materials, and I told you I don't want to give a too orthodox lecture on nitriding, but I consider the interdependencies. You see this picture, why is that important? Because when we know what can we obtain on the material, we have to, the end goal is to make engineering components. An engineering component has to be designed, has to be developed, and is part of a system. The classical phenomenon in designing engineering components, that was from the, anyway, the functional principle and the technical need, that's not to discuss about. But we made the general technical design, and then we designed components. When we designed components, then it went to the technology. We were selecting materials, and certainly, when all these were ready, what could we do? We had to select the manufacturing technology, right? So we had to select the manufacturing technology, and we had to select the service engineering technology. But that moment we were very limited, because if the material was selected and the product was constructed, our possibility in selecting manufacturing technology and especially surface engineering technology was limited. So when we learned after the 80s how important surface engineering is, and as the surface and the substrate together form a system, we had slowly to change the philosophy. And as I was directing for many years a research and development institute, so it was not so simple to learn people to think otherwise, to think not the classical way, but to change their thinking in selecting materials. So now, and this is now accepted more or less all over the world. Just last week I was at the Mercedes in Stuttgart. We had a very important development project together. And what the chief engineer for product development said was exactly that. The new concept. Which means that when we know what we want to obtain, first of all, then we select the materials and surface engineering technology, knowing that whatever we do, how we form the shape of the parts, how we form the parts. First of all, they have to resist the surface and bulk properties with those which we expect. In those circumstances, is it cold, is it hot, is it in the chemical environment or whatever. So this is why now is the first step is to select the material and surface engineering technology. So when we know that the surface engineering technology will be nitriding, we can combine what I have shown previously with that, and we can choose the material which is best for this purpose, and then we will have surface and bulk properties. Well, then it comes further as it is, so no differences, but the only difference that, you know, today we have the modeling and simulation, which is more and more used, and even we can develop materials using this modeling and simulation. Just tell you an example. In the American ASM published a report that today they made about 230,000, if I remember well, that's about 230,000 new materials simulated by computer, so without any laboratory testing. It's unbelievable. Well, not perfectly, let's say so, it's not finished here, because when we develop such kind of materials, then we will have to simulate the heat treatment, the surface treatment, and then we have to take it to the laboratory and to see if the simulation gave us or not the correct results. So this is a more complex, but we have to accept that this is. Well, the quality assurance is extremely important. We will talk a few words about this, and certainly confirmation in the quality certification. Well, when we go back to the nitriding, because all these are, I just wanted to show you that they are involving a lot of other things. It's not just enough to say that we introduce nitrogen into the surface. Well, it's, as I said earlier, that it's processed in the ferritic phase, which means it's requiring no structural transformation. So this is no deformation. Well, they asked me, we are running 4 furnaces constantly for the nitriding, nitrocalcarizing. And many people are coming with rather sophisticated parts, and you will see them at the end of the presentation, a few of them. And they ask, what is the deformation? Well, I said, it's depending on you. If you made all the preliminary treatments according to the rule, and we will see what the rule is, then you have no deformation. All the deformation is only a very slight increase of a couple of microns due to the formation of the compound layer. Practically, as there are no transformation, and So we have practically no deformation. Let's see why do we do the nitriding. When we talk about nitriding, I talk about everything, so not just the nitriding, but I talk about everything as well. Because when we consider the functional and structural properties, the tribological properties, chemical properties, like corrosion, oxidation, and mechanical properties, strength, fatigue resistance, well, that means the nitriding will give us excellent tribological properties. It will also, the fatigue resistance, will increase the fatigue resistance, especially the surface fatigue. You know, the surface fatigue is a very tricky problem sometimes when we consider, for instance, gears. And gears, surface fatigue is extremely important. Thus, through nitriding, nitrocarburizing, we can improve also fatigue resistance. And then the physical properties, thermo-optical properties, they are not too much modified by the nitriding. Biomedical properties, this is a tricky question, because biomedical properties, which are more and more important today, are modified, but we are not completely aware of these modifications. You know that there are a lot of different joints are made of stainless steel or different titanium or different metals to make operations, and these operations are more and more important because earlier such problems of hip joints or knee joints typical for old people above 60, and now this went down to about 30-35 years. So, and this is extremely difficult because it will practically limit your possibility of moving. So this is extremely important, and these properties also can be modified by nitriding. We had some research program. Maria was also working in this research program where we applied ion implantation, nitrogen ion implantation into the stainless steel surface to obtain a better biomedical property. But this is a particular field, but it's also important to know about, so just to be aware that this is something which exists. So, when we want to see what happens practically, just a few words. I promise you I don't want to enter into details with the physics and chemistry of the ray formation, but definitely we have, in a way or other, some active nitrogen and carbon atoms in the environment. This environment may be plasma, this environment may be gas, may be salt. It's not important, but anyway, we will have active atoms. This is on the interface, and this is the most important, will form some reactions on the interface. This is the interface reactions are those which will determine what happens further. So these reactions on the interface are the most complicated phenomenon what happens in nitriding. Because then further the diffusion has its rules, and the nitrogen and carbon will diffuse into the substrate. So, the most critical is what are the reactions on the surface. So the interface reactions are the most important. Let's accept this. I don't enter into details with that, because that was not the goal of my presentation. If you are interested, I can give you a lot of details. But let's accept that this is basically the principle. And when we go further, there are a lot of very different surface reactions which will happen on the interface. These surface reactions will be modified according to the composition of the gas. Usually, gas or the media, sorry, not only the gas. Usually, now is the most important, the nitrocarburizing So that are more complicated, more sophisticated reactions. And these are reactions with carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. Well, we ask what is oxygen to do? Well, this is a very interesting thing, and this was which practically attracted me to the nitriding, because oxygen is activating the surface. We will come back here. That is our time is short, so we come back here. The classical procedure is gas nitriding. So this was, which was developed in the early 1930s, and which, Maria, how much time do I have?
15 minutes?
Okay. Okay. I don't want to spoil your program. So, you see, I made a lot of experiments to see how the surface activity will influence the treatment, and that's very important. So I used different kind of surface preparation. This was polished, rough polishing, grinding, or S-rolled, then chemically etched, and then treating. So these 5 surface preparation techniques were applied. But what is important? When we made the treatment without oxygen, we got this kind of increase in the weight, so practically nitrogen uptake. When we had oxygen in the atmosphere, these are. So it's very clear something happens which is connected to the oxygen. How is this oxygen present in the treating media? That's a different matter. Certainly it's different when it is in salt baths, when it is in the atmosphere, when it is in the plasma. But basically, we have to know that the surface preparation plays a very important role. What kind of surface treatment we can apply and what will be the result of the surface treatment. So, you see, if the nitrogen uptake differs so much by the surface activity, that cannot be just forgotten. So, what I have shown you here is the undissociated ammonia, so the ammonia-arrested gas of nitriding, shows the reaction rate, and you see the reaction rate is much, much lower when we have no oxygen in the atmosphere than when we have oxygen in the atmosphere. So that was the first thing which we learned, that when we want to activate nitriding, and we have to solve in a way or other the presence of oxygen. So, well, I can go back a little bit. Most of our preoccupations were for industrial application. And we were working in the field of textile machines. This is a large diameter knitting machine. This is a high-speed sewing machine. Overlock machine, that's how we say. What that means high speed? High speed means that they are running at up to 20,000 a minute, and they stop up to about 40 times a minute. So then what can I say? It will have a runtime of about 2 to 2.5 seconds. It has to achieve 20,000 stop, 20,000 and stop. So it's no doubt that the solicitations are tremendous. At that time I didn't know, but then I learned that there are only 2 application fields where the solicitations are more critical and more problematic than in textile machines. The weapon and aviation, so aircraft and weapons. It's, in a way, it's unbelievable, because we used to say when there is a sewing machine, the needle is running up and down and up and so what? Well, that's not so simple. And when we consider the high-speed industrial sewing machines, just like this one, which have also a lot of parts, in an alternative movement. So the solicitations are tremendous. So the surface is the best way to test a surface engineering procedure by such kind of a machine. And this is a simple machine, it doesn't cost so much, so even if you destroy it, it doesn't happen. Two critical things. Or a large diameter knitting machine, a large diameter knitting machine. You have this is a large diameter cylinder. There are about 2,000 cuts, slots on the surface. In these slots, the knitting needles are sliding up and down, and they will always get into contact with the control cams, and at this moment the solicitation is very high because it is a very narrow angle and the needle has to raise or to go down, and the solicitations are enormous. So this was my first task, to solve by nitriding such kind of the treatment of such kind of a part. It was very interesting, and we succeeded to do it. Well, now, after gaseous nitriding, we got back to obtain some other surfaces. Just let's show you some of the structure. You see, this is a typical structure of gaseous nitrided sample. So this is very fine. A kind of, you see, this is the lower layer still. The basic structure is a kind of temporal martensite, because for the stability, when we don't want to have any deformations afterwards during the machining and during the final finishing, we have to have a stable structure, and the only stable structure is the temporal martensite. So we always, when we want to have a very stable part, we don't want any deformation later, then we quench and temper at a high temperature, which is higher than the nitriding temperature, and then we have a stable structure, no deformations occur. And that is not enough, because we also, when the machining is complicated, just like for those cylinders I have shown you, we have to have at least 2 to 3 stress relieving. Stress relieving always on an increasing temperature, and we have to go with the last stress relieving with a temperature higher than the nitriding temperature. Then, indeed, we have no deformation at all. Well, so this is, you see very well, is the diffusion layer. It's a low magnification, so you don't see the needle. So we talked about the ferritic nitrocarburizing, just a few words. And the difference is very clear, you see. The difference is that we have a surface layer, which is a compound layer. This is at high magnification. It's about 1,000 times the microscopic magnification. And you see this is the substrate. Well, we have the diffusion and some nitride precipitates you can see here. But then you have the combination layer, the compound layer, which is practically that layer with a kind of ceramic character. And then the outer layer with a porosity. This is also very important. The porosity can be controlled. And it's important because in the pores, the lubricating media may be introduced, and this will show you an extremely good surface property. So, there are different methods to control the porosity, and that's exactly what we are working now also, to have this controlled porosity in other processes as well, because I consider that the new development in nanographite gives us new possibilities to obtain very, very resistant surface layers. These are different, they show, this is a layer which is much too porous. We cannot use it, only if we will remove this part. But this part of the layer is good. This is a perfect layer. You see, if we control in the process the ammonia partial pressure, then we can obtain a region where we have high hardness, we have stable layer and no porosity. This is an important diagram. So I told you that I do not enter into the technological details because I wanted to give you an idea what is and what for. Well, these are two important pictures because they were unique in the world. They were the first time that we demonstrated using electron microscopy that the compound layer is able to dissolve the carbides in perovite. You see, this is a typical perovite region, and you see how the compound layer is protruding on the grain boundaries, and it slowly will dissolve the carbides, and this gives an why is that important? Because this means that the connection between the compound layer and the substrate is extremely organic. So it's not just a deposited layer, it's a very organic connection, which means it will not wear. It will remain on the surface. And when we take on electron microscope this kind of the layer, so the compound layer, we will see that some nitrogen atoms are formed in the layer. This gives the porosity. So this is a picture of the porosity. Well, I don't enter now too much in testing because time is running out. So just to know that testing of the results is always as important as the technology itself. So whenever we talk about the technology, we have to think, how will we control the results? And it was interesting, my discussion last week by Mercedes. It was a question with the director for development put me, when you think about technology, will you give us also the technique for controlling the results? Will you give us also the rules for quality assessment? And certainly the only answer which was accepted is yes. It's not so easy. Okay, so I just want to show you one thing, because this was a completely new procedure which we developed with my team. This is the so-called reversing bending, because the fracture toughness and the fracture morphology of the surface layers is extremely important. So when we applied, you probably learned about the Ericsson testing method for deep drawing. Well, we used such a reverse method because the treated surface is outside, and then we applied the force to deform the layer, and we were video monitoring the acoustic emission, the surface layer, and this network of cracks will give you a lot if you analyze how this layer will behave. And there are very different possibilities. I just show you these four and then I finish this part because it's we can go differently. This is salt bath. What you see is a salt inclusion, and in a salt inclusion, when you give this deformation, it will explode, starting from the salt, and then the specific network will form. When you take plasma nitriding, for instance, it's very interesting. It doesn't form the network of cracks at once. First, it will form a network of parallel cracks, and then sliding. So it's a very complicated, very sophisticated part. This is for plasma nitrocarburizing, and this is for gas nitrocarburizing. You see, it's a random kind. But these are important. Certainly, we can talk a lot about this, and also different possibilities for testing the wear resistance, which you learned. But this could be still interesting, a synthetic comparison of different nitrocarburizing methods. And you see salt bath, gaseous atmosphere, and plasma. What is important? Unfortunately, we can say that the salt bath gives the best results. But as we have a lot of environmental regulations, unfortunately sawdust is slowly excluded. So we have to go back and to use the gaseous atmosphere or plasma. They are both almost the same criteria, so we can do whatever we want, and certainly as the control procedures are now better and better, we can obtain very good results and very good layers in gas or in plasma. Now, in my company, we are basically working in plasma, and most of the treatments what we do are in plasma. We are running 4 plasma nitriding units round the clock, 7 days a week, 24 hours. And just to have a few pictures, just to have an idea what is, these are the 3 nitriding units, the one you have also. So these are the small nitriding units, is 15 or 30 kV. But we also have a bigger unit, which we just put into function last year. It's a 70 kV unit with 800 mm diameter and 2.5 meter depth. So this is an extremely good business also. Just a few parts. You see, there are very different parts we can treat, but these are extremely tricky. Such parts are for a chemical work in Canada. And you can imagine what that means if they are able to send 4 pieces from Canada to us, to Kolozsvary, just to treat them and send it back. Why? Not because they can't do it in the States or in Canada, but with the large furnaces it's extremely costly, so it's cheaper to send it to us where I have small furnaces and we can treat just 1 or 2 pieces together. But what is problematic? We have to have a good surface layer on the shaft, but also each of these 500 holes have to be treated inside. And this you only can do with active screening. So this is a special technology. I promise you I don't enter the technological details. There are some other parts as well. And you see how are they loaded into the furnace. And that's it. So I thank you for your attention. You can put me any questions you want. And you can be very happy because this was just a short part. So when I presented in India or in China, that's a course of 2 hours or 2 hours. So it's about 4 hours altogether. But then we enter into reaction details and such kind of things. So I just wanted to give you an idea what is it and how is integrated into the development process of engineering components and into our basic philosophy of being engineers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I'm sure that we received not the orthodox type of lecture which will give you the same feeling as you read a book, but here you could see and you could hear excellent examples on the complexity of engineering, and we could get also a taste of inventing new things and recognizing new phenomenon and then resulting in new development areas. I promise to you that you can ask also in Hungarian. So now you can ask the Hungarian students, of course, and colleagues can ask Hungarian, and Karolina can remain with with English. I don't promise that
you can choose 4 languages. You can choose 4 languages: the Hungarian, the English, the German, and the Romanian. So whatever you wish.
And even French.
And even French, yes. Even Italian if that's needed, but it's basically.
So, tehát lehet kérdezni, hogyha gondolják.
Jövő jéges anyanyelvünkön is legalább olyan szép az egész mindenség, az angol. De jó, hogy ez volt a beállítás.
Én egy dolgot hadd kérdezzek, akkor átlátok. So let me ask just one question. How do you see the importance of surface engineering and also nitriding in automotive industry? Because you know well that in Hungary this is the most important sector of the industry. So how do you see how important it will be in the future, and
It
what
is
kind of
also
a
now.
future you can gain as a heat treater.
That's why I was invited to the Mercedes last week. So it's, the automotive industry is now extremely sensitive, and it gives a lot of problems because the solicitations are higher and higher, and the requested properties are amazing. Just to tell you a few examples, what they presented me last week, they have shown some of the turbine. The turbine, which is in a truck, is running with 200,000 rotations a minute. It's unimaginable. In up-to-date Mercedes car, the turbine is running at 350,000 a minute. It's unimaginable. You don't even understand it. And now the power what the new engine has to cover is about 250 kV per liter. Can you imagine it? What that means? That in 1 liter engine has to give 250 horsepower, sorry, not kV, horsepower. It's unbelievable. So, and this development in the engine and in all the rest of the parts will give you more and more solicitations for the surface treatment. I am working in a project where now the managing the project is at the Imperial College in London, and the goal is to change some of the car and airplane frame parts from steel to aluminum. Aluminum is very tricky to deform and doesn't accept any kind of lubricant and so on. So our goal is to treat the dies, and the dies are up to 4 meters or something like this, to treat, to give them a good wear resistance. The best wear resistance we obtain by nitrocarburizing. And I hope that here we can make together with Miskolci University one step further with nano graphite filling, because this is important. So why did I say this? Because there are two different things the automotive industry is interested in. One, the final treatment of parts to give them a very good wear resistance, service life, and that. And the other is the technology. So the tools have to be with a good service life, with excellent properties, with low fatigue and such kind of things. So when we talk about nitriding, we talk on two different fields. One is to nitride the parts, and this is extremely important for camshafts, for instance, crankshaft, and some other parts. And the other is the tools. Just to tell you a small example of my use. When we developed the first salt-bath nitrocarburizing, I had an old Volkswagen, the Beetle. It was an excellent car, actually. And it had a problem. The suspension was with sliding sleeves. And it was worn, and then it gave us a lot of problems. So I had an idea, let's try to improve it. And I made these parts of a low alloy steels. I treated them by hard chromium plating, and the sleeves I nitrocarburized. The result was excellent, and all the cars in Romania, so those Volkswagen cars in Romania at that time, it was in the early 70s, they came to make these spare parts. It was a very good business, unfortunately not for me, but for the company I was working that time. So the nitriding is more and more requested in the automotive industry for different parts, especially those parts which are for surface fatigue, which are also for the lack of lubrication, at least intermittent lubrication, because the nitriding layers gives very good surface properties in this intermittent lubrication as well. I can tell you quite a lot of examples, but I think that nitriding in different versions is more and more important in
the automotive industry. That's why they finance more research in this aspect also.
Thank you very much.